The Sumerian religion is the world's oldest religion. Not only is it the world's oldest religion, but this religion forms the foundations of the Akkadian, the Assyrian, and the Babylonian religions. But what I'm interested in is why this religion came into being. I mean, why was there such a need for such a fundamental change in beliefs? So in this video, we're going to examine why there was a need for such a change. And we're going to compare and contrast it to the previous belief system of the Neolithic. And we'll dig deep to see if we can understand what the Sumerian religion was all about. We'll talk about the main deities of the Pantheon. We'll talk about the cosmology, the way they saw how the world worked. And we'll talk about the main myths of the Sumerian religion. So stay with us and we'll get stuck right in. So, long before the gods ruled the heavens, beliefs were focused on nature and nature spirits. And these were the beliefs of the Neolithic people that preceded organised religions. They were more animistic in their beliefs. They venerated the ancestors, and it was the great spirits, the spirits of the sun and the moon, and the local spirits that dominated their world. So how did this Neolithic animism and ancestor veneration evolve into the structured pantheon of hierarchical gods of the Sumerians? So let's ask now, why did this change occur? Why the change from the animistic and shamanistic beliefs of the Neolithic to the more organised religions of the Sumerians? Well, it was all down to changing society. Society evolved. The Neolithic people lived in small communities, and their beliefs were focused around their local area and their daily activities. So, for instance, being small farming communities, the cycle of the sun was extremely important to them. The cycle of the sun told them when they should plant their crops and when they should harvest them. And everything in their animistic view had a soul, had a spirit, and a life. But societies evolved, and soon they were becoming more efficient at farming, and they were producing surpluses. And soon these small communities grew into much larger cities, along with rulers and kings. And it was these changes in society that brought about the need for a much more organised and structured belief system. One, ideally, that would reflect the hierarchy of the now ruling class. And so began the reorganisation of these one spirits into this pantheon of hierarchical gods. And the kings themselves, the rulers of these cities, well, they were quite often seen as the mediator between the people and the gods, hence giving them undisputed power and authority over the rest of the population. Then, of course, we needed an organised priesthood to tell the population, to tell the people just how they should worship these gods. And with that came the temples and the places of worship. And organised religion had begun. And if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the Neolithic beliefs, then I did a video about that a short while ago. And I'll put a link to it up here and one in the description down below, so you can go and watch that a little later. So before we move on, it's probably a good idea to get some kind of understanding of the time and the location that we're talking about. And the time is around 3000 BC, and the area, southern Mesopotamia, or what is now known as Iraq. The Samrian religion introduced a new concept of deity, that of polytheism, where the Neolithic people saw the world as inhabited by spirits. The Sumerians saw the world and the cosmic order was not so much inhabited by spirits, but controlled by various gods. So, for instance, where the Neolithic people saw the sun as being a living, intelligent entity in its own right, while the Sumerians believed that there was a god who had dominion over the sun, and he himself was manifest into the physical world through the sun. So instead of the old Neolithic beliefs that everything was alive and everything had a spirit, the idea was now that there were a set of gods, a hierarchical set of gods that controlled everything within the cosmos. And along with this structured hierarchy of polytheistic gods came a formalized priesthood, and they had temples and a structured mythology which told them everything they would ever need to know, including how the world came into being in the first place and how everything was structured. So here seems to be a very good time to introduce the creation myth. And I'll put some nice pretty pictures up on the screen for you now while I read my notes. So, in the beginning, there was Namu, the primeval sea, and from Namu arose An, heaven, and Ki, earth. An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess, came together and produced Enlil. Enlil separated the heaven and the earth, becoming lord of the air and the winds. Later, Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, organised the world, assigning duties to the gods and creating humans from clay to work the land and serve the gods. So that's the creation story in a nutshell. So now that we've introduced some of the gods, let's look at the rest of the main gods in the Pantheon, and we'll start with the main god, the father god, An, the sky father. Then we have Enlil, the god of the air, wind, and the storms, the authoritative god. And then we have Enki, the god of fresh water, the fresh water that in their case, in their cosmology, the fresh water that runs under the earth. And we have Ki, the earth mother. Then there's Inanna, the goddess of fertility. Moving then down to the god Utu, the sun god. And we also have a moon god, Nana. And we have a god of the underworld, Ereshkigal, who is the queen of the dead and the queen of the underworld realm. And last but not least, the god Dumuzi, the shepherd god. And we'll get to Dumuzi a little later when we talk of the myth of Inanna and her journey through the underworld. So let's now get to cosmology, and for those of you that have followed the channel in the past, you'll know that I've often spoken about the Celtic cosmology, or the way the Celts saw that the world was structured, and that was, they saw that there were three worlds: the world of sky, the world of land, and then there was the underworld. So the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. Now, the Sumerians' landscape was somewhat slightly different. They had the upper world, the world of sky, and they had the Earth Mother, the Earth itself, and between the Earth was the domain of the air. Beneath the Earth lay bubbling a layer of fresh water, and this was Enki's domain. And of course, the fresh water was a very important life-giving resource to these people who lived in these arid conditions. The water was very important for themselves, their farms, and their livestock. So it's not really surprising that fresh water played a very important part in their entire belief system. And then beneath all of this was the land of the underworld, a place where the dead went to lay and rest for an eternity. And the underworld, in the Sumerian viewpoint, was not a very nice place. It was dark and murky, and the only comfort you would get would depend entirely on just how well your descendants appease the gods and give offerings. So let's now come to some of the myths, and the first myth I want to cover is one that's really very important and has a highly symbolic meaning behind it, and that is Inanna's descent into the underworld. So the whole story starts with Inanna wishing to visit her sister Ereshkigal in the underworld. To get to the underworld, Inanna has to pass through the 7 gates that lead to the underworld. At each gate, she's challenged by the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper makes her give up one of her personal items. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal's domain, she's naked and powerless. Now, her meeting with Ereshkigal didn't go quite according to plan. Ereshkigal judges Inanna and determines that she must die. And so she kills Inanna, and she hangs her corpse on a hook. Now, with Inanna's death, the world is just not the same. The goddess of fertility is dead, and the world is in chaos. Enki, who's also not just the god of the fresh life-giving waters, but the god of wisdom, determines that something must be done. And so Enki, in his wisdom, creates 2 tiny beings that he sends down to the underworld with life-giving food. So the beings find Inanna, and they give her the life-giving food. And Inanna is able to resurrect and leave the underworld with only one small problem. For somebody to leave the underworld, the law states that someone must return in their place. Now, when Inanna returns, she's a bit dismayed to find that her husband Dumuzi, instead of mourning her death, was enjoying life. So a pretty obvious choice, and it certainly took the complexity out of having to make that decision. And Dumuzi was chosen to replace Inanna in the underworld. A very sad end for Dumuzi, you may think, but luckily for him, he had a very generous sister, Inanna, who decided that she would share his fate. And so instead of Dumuzi having to spend the rest of eternity in the underworld, they would take turns, one above and one below. And so there again we have it, the constant cycle of life, death, and rebirth, which is echoed in so many other religions today. So now we come to the story that tells us of the creation of humans. The story tells us that the gods, well, they're tired and fed up of having to have to do all this manual labour. After all, they're gods. Why should they have to build irrigation canals to channel all this fresh water and do all the other bits and pieces? So Enki, the god of wisdom, comes to the rescue once again, and he proposes that instead of the gods having to have to do all this hard work, why don't we create some little creatures that will do all that for us? So Enki and the mother goddess together decide to create these little humans from a mixture of clay and divine essence. So then this was the entire idea of humans, and this was their purpose: to serve and to worship the gods. But the story doesn't quite just end there. It leads into another myth, a myth of the destruction of humans and the Great Flood. And this myth tells us that Enlil, well, he's tired of all the noise and the fuss of these little humans running about, and he wants them gone. He wants an end to them. And so the short version of this story is that Enlil decides to bring upon them a catastrophic flood that will wipe them all off the face of the earth. But Enki, well, he's not too sure about this plan. I mean, after all, the humans were his creation. There were a few bad eggs for sure, but to get rid of them all, so he decided to warn them. And one he sought out, Ziusudra, one who he thought was particularly pious and worthy. He spoke to Ziusudra, and he gave him instructions on how to build a large boat and how to survive the flood. Now that story might sound a little familiar to you, and it should do, because that story is the same story that has been told and retold through many cultures. The flood, the boat, and the survival of only the chosen and the worthy. So that's the Sumerian belief system for you, the oldest known organised religion in the world today. And we've discussed why the changes, why the religion came about, and we've discussed the religion in detail. So if you liked today's episode, then don't forget that old thumbs up and drop your comments down below. And if you like this kind of content and you're not subscribed already, then make sure to press that subscribe button. And with that, I'll see you all again very soon on the next one.